Imagine the sound of water lapping against the banks of a slow medieval river. The morning mist hangs low, wrapping the fields in a gray veil. At the edge of the water, women bend over with tired backs, their hands plunged into the icy current. This is the world of medieval laundry, tedious, repetitive, and so unremarkable that even the records of it feel like a lullaby of monotony. Laundry was not a small task. It was a burden that returned again and again, week after week, with no end in sight. Unlike the noble stories of knights and kings, there were no triumphs here, only piles of linens, stained from the ordinary wear of peasant life, tunics, heavy with sweat, cloaks dirtied with soil, bedding marked with the signs of daily existence. Each item had to be scrubbed, rinsed, wrung, and dried, again and again, like an endless cycle that mirrored the passing of the days themselves. The washerwomen would gather early, before the sun fully rose, because the work stretched long into the day. They carried baskets of linen on their hips, trudging down narrow village paths to the stream or the riverbank. Sometimes they used wooden tubs filled with water heated over fires. But more often, it was the biting chill of natural streams that did the work. Their fingers numbed as they rubbed fabric against smooth stones, coaxing out the dirt with ashlie soap, or, when times were lean, simply with sand and water. Every motion was the same. Dip, scrub, beat, rinse, wring, over and over. A single tunic could take half an hour, and when it was finished, there were 10 more waiting. Then came the stockings, the cloaks, the bed linens. The monotony piled as high as the laundry itself. Imagine the rhythm of their arms, like a slow chant. Dip, scrub, beat, rinse, wring. Dip, scrub, beat, rinse, wring. Hours passed in this repetition, until the body ached and the mind dulled. To the medieval washerwoman, there was nothing exciting about her work. She did not imagine herself in the pages of chronicles. No clerk would praise her effort. At best, a line in some dusty account book might record payment to the laundress for 12 linens, 3 tunics, and 1 pair of hose. The entry would be as flat and lifeless as the fabric spread on the grass to dry. Yet, in its very dullness, it captures the essence of daily life better than any battle ever could. The sound of beating cloth echoed across villages, a steady percussion that marked the day. Unlike the clang of swords or the ringing of bells, this was the sound of ordinary endurance. It was boring, and that boredom was the constant companion of survival. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the rhythm of it, the slap of wet cloth against smooth stone, the splash of water as buckets are tipped, the low murmur of women speaking softly as they work. There was no rush, only the slow insistence of a job that would not finish until every garment was cleaned. The monotony stretched the hours thin, until day itself seemed woven into the fabric being scrubbed in monasteries. Laundry was a matter of record. Monks, sworn to order and precision, kept careful lists of what was washed, and when. A line might read, 3 robes, 4 cowls, 1 sheet. The words sat in neat rows, like soldiers lined in formation, each as dull as the one before it. But to the men who wrote them, this was discipline, evidence that even the smallest duties were carried out faithfully. To us, centuries later, these same records whisper of boredom so deep, it feels almost soothing. Laundry was heavy work. Wet cloth weighed far more than dry, and washerwomen hauled dripping tunics to lay them across bushes, hedges, or wooden racks in the sun. Wind tugged at the fabric, carrying droplets into the air, and when it rained, the entire effort could be undone, forcing them to start again. In winter, frost clung to sleeves and hose, stiffening them like boards. Imagine beating frozen cloth against stone, your knuckles raw, your breath clouding in the air. It was also a job without an end. The moment one week's laundry dried, the next week's piles began to gather. Children dirtied their tunics, men sweated through their hose, women stained their aprons with flour or soil. Beds needed airing, towels needed washing, cloaks soaked with rain had to be scrubbed. It was a cycle without celebration and without finish. Laundry, unlike harvest or feast, had no festival to mark its completion. It simply began again, as sure as sunrise. For peasants, clothing was few but precious. A single tunic might last years, patched until the cloth grew thin and weak. Washing was both necessary and dangerous too. Much scrubbing could wear out the garment before its time, and then there would be nothing to replace it. So washerwomen worked with care, balancing the need for cleanliness with the fear of loss. A ruined garment was no small thing. It meant hardship, cold nights, or shame in the village. When you imagine this, you begin to feel the quiet weight of their lives. Laundry was not dramatic. It had no climax, no heroes, no songs, but it shaped each day with its rhythm. The beating of cloth, the dripping of water, the endless repetition. This was the music of survival. And though the chroniclers never thought to write it, the monotony of laundry was as real, as constant, as the tolling of church bells across the fields. To picture medieval laundry is to imagine a scene stripped of all drama. There were no banners waving, no horns blowing, no heroes riding into battle. Instead, there was only a row of tired figures kneeling by the water, sleeves rolled up, hands reddened from the cold. The air smelled of damp wool and wood smoke drifting from village hearths. The ground beneath them was muddy, worn by years of the same footsteps returning to the same task. The tools of the trade were humble. A wooden tub, darkened by years of use. A smooth stone, chosen for its flat surface. A block of coarse soap, made from ash lye mixed with animal fat, its sharp smell lingering on the skin. Nothing was elegant. Nothing was efficient. Yet these were the instruments that stood between cleanliness and squalor. Each had its place. Each was used until it wore away, then replaced with something equally plain. Records of laundry, when they survive, read like the dullest poetry imaginable. Washed, 2 sheets, 1 coverlet, 4 tunics, 3 hose. The words march down the page, each identical, each monotonous. There are no notes of joy, no sighs of exhaustion, no chatter of gossip, only the flat acknowledgement that work was done, repeated as often as the garments themselves. To read these lists is to feel a strange calm descend. The sameness lulls the mind, pulling it into a slow rhythm, not unlike the washerwoman's own. Clerks did not bother with detail. They did not write whether the river water was icy, or if the soap burned the skin, or if the wind stole garments from the line. They did not note the laughter of children nearby, or the aching muscles of women who labored long into the day. For the record keepers, all of that was irrelevant. What mattered was the number of garments, tallied and preserved. Yet for us, centuries later, those numbers are the doorway into imagining all that was left unsaid. Laundry was also a communal act. Washerwomen rarely worked alone. They gathered together, partly for company, partly for safety. In their shared labor, stories were told, jokes whispered, complaints aired. The work itself was dull, but the presence of others softened its edge. Still, even laughter could not erase the boredom. The tasks stretched on, each scrub as tedious as the last, each tunic no different from the next. At the end of the day, when the garments hung limp on bushes or lines, the women carried their baskets home, arms aching from the weight. The village road was quiet, the same road they had walked that morning. Tomorrow, or the next day, they would return again, because laundry never ceased. It was a duty as constant as hunger, as unyielding as time. And so, in this small repetitive act, we glimpsed the true heart of medieval life, not war or glory, but the ordinary grind of chores. A grind so monotonous that it becomes strangely comforting, like a lullaby whispered over and over until sleep takes hold. Evening fell slowly over the village, but the work of laundry did not vanish with the fading sun. Wet garments still clung to lines, heavy and dripping, refusing to dry in the damp air. Washerwomen gathered their baskets, lifting shirts and cloaks that were still cool to the touch, folding them as best they could. The day had been long, and yet tomorrow promised the same cycle again. There was no end, only repetition. To walk past a cottage, you would see the evidence of their labor. Tunics hung across branches, sheets spread over hedges, stockings pinned awkwardly to ropes. The sight was ordinary, unremarkable, and yet it was the rhythm of life itself. Without laundry, illness spread. Without clean cloth, shame grew. And so the dullest of tasks was also one of the most essential, performed without glory, but with steady endurance. The clerks who recorded these details must have felt the same monotony. Day after day, their quills scratched across parchment, writing down the same lists. 1 tunic, washed. 2 linens washed. 3 hose, washed. The repetition blurred the ink as surely as it blurred the mind. Did the clerks yawn as they wrote? Did their eyelids grow heavy with the sameness? Perhaps the very act of writing these lists was as soporific as hearing them now, centuries later. Yet, there was a strange comfort in it. Laundry was never done, but it was always there. It bound the days together in its steady insistence. In spring, the garments smelled of river water and green fields. In winter, they froze stiff before they could dry. In every season, the washerwomen bent their backs, dipped their arms into water, and worked. Life changed kings, rose and fell. Wars flared and faded, but laundry remained. There is something deeply human in that constancy. We do not live only in battles or feasts. We live in chores, in repetition, in the quiet turning of tasks that must be done whether or not anyone sings of them. The boring history of medieval laundry is, in truth, the history of survival itself. So as you listen, let the rhythm of it carry you. The dip, the scrub, the beat, the rinse, the ring, over and over. Like the ticking of a clock, like the beating of a heart. The monotony is not punishment, it is comfort. It is the sound of countless hands across centuries, performing the same task with the same weary patience. And in that sameness, there is peace. Close your eyes and imagine the soft splash of water, the slow flapping of cloth in the wind, the gentle murmur of voices fading into night. Laundry was boring then, and boring now. But in its very dullness lies its gift, the ability to lull the mind, to soothe the spirit, and to lead you, quietly, toward rest. The life of a washerwoman was one of quiet repetition, marked not by events, but by cycles. Each morning began with the weight of expectation, baskets of soiled garments waiting to be carried, streams waiting to be filled with the slap of cloth, neighbors waiting with the same burdens on their backs. The washerwoman was never idle. Even when her hands rested, her mind circled back to the same question: when will the next load need scrubbing? Her day often began before sunrise. The air was damp, the cottages still dark, but already she was lifting baskets lined with coarse fabric. Tunics, linens, hose, and cloaks lay heaped inside, heavy even before they were soaked with water. The path to the river was narrow and muddy, worn by generations of feet carrying the same weight. Sometimes, in larger towns, washerwomen gathered in shared spaces, wooden tubs in courtyards, or laundry yards maintained by monks. But more often, it was the village stream, shallow and cold, that became the workplace. There, she would kneel for hours. Her skirts were tucked high, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and her hands plunged into water so cold it burned. The cloth was pounded against smooth stones, rubbed with ash-lye soap, rinsed, and wrung out until her arms ached. Every motion was familiar. There was no artistry, no variation, only the same repeated gestures, carried out until the day blurred into the sound of splashing water and the rhythm of her own breathing. And yet, despite the boredom, there was no escape. Laundry was necessary. A tunic soiled too heavily carried disease. Sheets left unwashed carried shame. For the poor, garments were precious, worn again and again until they grew thin. For the wealthy, garments were plentiful, and so the washerwoman's work multiplied, stretching from dawn until dusk. In noble houses, laundresses dealt with endless linens, towels, and undergarments, their hands raw from the constant scrubbing. In monasteries, the habits of monks piled in baskets, each robe indistinguishable from the next, each robe demanding the same dull care. It was a life without recognition. No chronicler praised a washerwoman, no poet sang of her labor. Her name, if it appeared at all, was hidden in account books, marked simply as payment to the laundress. Her work was as invisible as the soapsuds that vanished downriver, leaving no trace behind. And yet, without her, the village would have reeked of filth, and households would have sunk into disorder. Her dull, repetitive labor was the silent foundation of cleanliness. The washerwoman lived in this cycle her whole life. As a child, she might have carried small bundles to the stream. As a young woman, she bent beside older women, learning the motions. As an elder, her body stooped with years of the same task. She guided the younger ones who came after. Each generation performed the same movements. Each generation handed down the same monotonous rhythm. If you were to stand by the riverbank on a clear morning, you would notice that washerwomen rarely worked in silence. Though the task was dull, voices filled the air, low murmurs, occasional laughter, the exchange of news and gossip. Laundry was, in a way, a gathering place. Women who spent most of their lives inside cottages came together here, side by side, their hands busy while their tongues moved freely. The conversations, however, did not erase the monotony of their labor. Each woman bent over her bundle, scrubbing the same fabric again and again until her knuckles grew sore. The soap, harsh and biting, left her skin cracked and raw. In winter, the cold of the water turned her fingers numb. In summer, the sun baked her back until sweat dripped into the river. Pain was constant, though it was rarely spoken of. Complaints were muttered, but quickly swallowed. What use was it to curse a task that had no end? Laundry also shaped the body. A washerwoman's arms were strong from beating cloth against stone, her shoulders broad from lifting baskets, her spine curved from years of stooping. The toll was quiet, but relentless. She did not become a figure of admiration, but her body bore the mark of endurance, as surely as a soldier bore scars. Yet, unlike the soldier, she was not remembered for her sacrifice. Her strength was invisible, her labor uncelebrated. Meals were often rushed. A piece of bread eaten with damp hands, perhaps a wedge of cheese, maybe a sip of ale if the household was generous. Breaks were short, because the laundry waited. Time belonged to the garments, not the women. Each tunic pulled at the minutes, each cloak stretched the hours. The washerwoman's day was consumed by cloth, and when she slept, she often dreamed of it, folds of fabric, endless and heavy, drifting through her mind like clouds. And yet, there was a strange companionship in this shared suffering. Women leaned on one another, not just for help lifting baskets, but for comfort in the dullness. A laugh over a missing sock, a whispered story about a neighbor, a sigh about aching arms. These were the threads of connection, woven into the work. Laundry was boring, but it was not lonely. The women formed a quiet community, held together not by joy, but by obligation. Children sometimes hovered nearby, chasing geese or splashing in the shallow water, their laughter rising above the slap of cloth. The washerwomen might scold them, but secretly the sound eased their monotony. For a moment, the riverbank felt alive, and the endless rhythm of laundry seemed lighter. Still, when the children grew tired and wandered away, the dull repetitions settled in once more. The washerwoman's work did not pause for the changing of seasons. In spring, the river ran fast and cold, with melted snow biting at her hands until they ached. The linens, heavy with water, clung to her fingers, and the breeze carried the damp smell of wet wool through the village. In summer, the air was hot, and the garments dried more quickly, but the sun scorched her back as she bent over her labor. The sweat of the workers mixed with the damp of the cloth, leaving them weary before the day was halfway through. Autumn brought mud. The paths to the river grew slick, the banks soft and unstable. More than once, a basket tipped and spilled its load into the dirt, forcing the washerwoman to begin again. Winter was the harshest season of all. Ice formed on the edges of the river, the water so frigid it numbed the body within minutes. Fingers cracked and bled from exposure, and cloth stiffened in the cold, refusing to yield to her hands. Yet, the laundry still demanded its due. No season excused its necessity. Her clothing reflected her work. She wore garments patched many times over, sleeves frayed from the constant wetness, skirts stained with soap and river mud. A cloth tied around her head kept her hair from trailing into the water, and her feet, often bare, grew rough and hardened from the river stones. There was no finery, no luxury, only practicality. Her tools were as plain as her dress, each one valued for function, never for beauty. Sometimes, she was paid in coin, but more often in kind food, ale, or a share of cloth. Payment was meager, barely enough to sustain her. And yet, the household could not do without her. The laundress was essential, though seldom acknowledged. If she vanished, the stink of unwashed garments would spread, the dignity of families would falter. Still, her role remained quiet, her face absent from chronicles. Her name lost to time. When dusk fell, she returned home with aching limbs. The work did not end there. Her own household needed care, children fed, hearth tended, her own garments mended. The rhythm of labor stretched from dawn to night without reprieve. Even in her sleep, she could not escape it. Dreams filled with the slap of cloth and the cold touch of water haunted her rest. To be a washerwoman was to live within a cycle of monotony. It was to carry the weight of garments and the weight of silence together. Yet, in that silence, there was endurance. Her life was not remarkable, but it was steady, and in its dullness, it sustained the world around her. The washerwoman's work was not hers alone. In noble households and monasteries, teams of laundresses worked together under supervision. The monotony was multiplied, their garments stacked in great heaps, bedding and robes piled until the sight alone was exhausting. Monastic records speak of dozens of robes washed in a single week, all identical, all demanding equal care. The laundresses bent in unison, their motions like a weary dance, repeated endlessly. The monotony was broken only by the occasional mishap, a garment lost to the current, a sleeve torn on a stone, soap dropped into the mud. These small accidents carried consequences. A lost tunic could not be replaced easily. A torn sheet meant repair, more work for hands already tired. The washerwoman bore the blame, though the fault was often circumstance, wind, water, chance. Such errors became quiet burdens, carried in silence. In some towns, laundresses gathered at public washing places built of stone, where water flowed through channels designed for their use. Here, their labor became almost ceremonial in its order. Cloth beaten against smooth surfaces, the same sound echoing through the air, over and over, until it felt as though the very walls absorbed the rhythm. To an outsider, it might have seemed impressive. To those within it, it was simply dull, a job, stretched across endless hours. There was little room for pride in the work. Clean garments were expected, not celebrated. The laundress received no thanks beyond payment, and often not even that. Her hands grew rough, her back bent, her body bore the cost. Yet, she returned each day, because the village could not function without her. The noble needed their linens, the monks their robes, the peasants their tunics. She carried their dignity on her shoulders, though none thought to honor her for it, and so, the washerwoman's life became an endless cycle. Garments soiled, garments washed, garments soiled again. The cycle had no climax, no resolution. It simply continued, as steady as the turning of the seasons, as relentless as time. To live such a life was to know boredom more deeply than most, to find patience in the dullness, or perhaps to find nothing at all but weariness taught by night. When the garments hung drying in the breeze and the river ran quiet again, the washerwoman returned home. Her cottage was modest, her hearth small, her rest brief. The day's labor lingered in her body, her arms still heavy with the memory of lifting, scrubbing, wringing. Yet, tomorrow, the work would call again. Laundry did not vanish, it only waited. Her children, if she had them, grew up in the shadow of her work. The daughters learned early to carry small loads, to wring out cloth, to mend torn sleeves. The sons saw the weight their mothers bore, though they themselves would not take up the task. Each generation repeated the pattern, as inevitable as the rising of the sun. The washerwoman's story rarely entered the record books, but her absence would have been felt instantly. Without her, garments would rot, households would falter, monasteries would reek of unwashed robes. She was invisible, yet indispensable, boring, yet essential. Her labor defined her, and through her, the rhythm of medieval life endured. It is in this monotony, this endless cycle of washing and drying, that we see the true fabric of history, not battles or kings, but the daily chores that sustained survival. The washerwoman's life was ordinary, even dull, but it was real, and in its dullness lies a strange comfort, the kind that soothes the mind and carries it gently toward sleep. If the washerwoman bore the weight of the laundry in her arms, the clerk bore it in his ink. His task was quieter, but no less repetitive. Day after day, he sat hunched over a wooden desk, a quill in his hand, parchment before him. His duty was not to wash but to record, and so he filled page after page with lists so monotonous that they seemed designed to lull the mind into stillness. The record books of monasteries and noble households are filled with such entries. A line might read, 2 tunics, washed. 1 cowl, washed. 3 linens, washed, then another, and another, until the eye blurs with sameness. The clerk wrote with care, not because the task inspired him, but because accuracy was demanded. Each garment needed to be accounted for, tallied, and entered. Any error meant confusion later, perhaps even punishment. So he wrote slowly, methodically, each letter formed with precision, each word echoing the one before it. The tools of his trade were as plain as those of the washerwoman, ink, dark and slightly gritty, made from oak galls and iron salts. Parchment scraped smooth from animal hide, expensive and never to be wasted. A quill, trimmed sharp, but wearing down with each stroke. He dipped the quill, shook off the excess ink, and pressed it to the page. The scratch of writing filled the silent chamber. A sound as steady as the beating of cloth on stone by the river. To modern eyes, the pages appear lifeless. Yet, within their dullness lies a story. Each line represents hours of unseen labor. The washerwoman bending by the river, the laundress scrubbing robes in the courtyard, the noble servant carrying baskets of damp garments. The clerk's pen froze these moments in numbers and words, stripped of emotion, stripped of life, leaving only a bare record of what was done. But what did he feel? This man with his ink-stained fingers and weary eyes, did he grow restless, longing for something more than laundry lists? Or did the repetition soothe him, each line a small act of order in a world that often felt chaotic? Perhaps, as he wrote, his mind drifted thinking not of tunics and hose, but of the rhythm of bells outside, or the sound of wind in the cloisters. His hand moved automatically, copying the same phrases, while his thoughts wandered elsewhere. Still, the record books endure, while the man himself has faded into dust. His name is forgotten, his face unknown, but his work remains. Pages upon pages of boring history, preserved in archives, waiting centuries to be read aloud in the calm of night. Their dullness transformed into a strange sort of lullaby. In monasteries, record-keeping was more than habit, was discipline. Monks believed that order reflected devotion, and so even the smallest chores were recorded with solemn care. A washing of robes might not seem holy, yet to the monastic clerk, it was part of the great tapestry of obedience. His pen moved slowly, carefully, shaping each word like a prayer. The entries did not change. 5 robes, washed. 1 cowl, washed. 6 towels, washed. The list repeated itself week after week, a cycle as predictable as the turning of the seasons. Reading them today, one is struck not by variety, but by sameness. Yet, that sameness reveals the rhythm of life in the cloister. Just as bells marked the hours, the records marked the chores. Nothing was too dull to note to the clerk. The page became a world. He bent over the parchment, the candlelight flickering against the stone walls, his hand steady as he filled another line. The room was quiet, but for the scratching of quill against skin. Sometimes, his back ached from hours at the desk. Sometimes, his eyes blurred from the dim light. Still, he continued. The work was endless, but it was also endless in its predictability, and that predictability was a comfort. We imagine boredom as a torment, but for the medieval clerk, it may have been a shield. In a world of uncertainty, war, famine, plague, the sameness of his records offered stability. The garments came, the garments were washed, the garments were written down. Life could fall into chaos outside the cloister walls, but within them, laundry remained constant. The dull lists survive now in archives, bound in volumes heavy with dust. They are rarely read, for their words offer little excitement. And yet, in their quiet way, they tell us more about the texture of daily life than chronicles of kings or knights. They show us what mattered enough to be preserved, not battles or poetry, but the simple fact that robes were laundered, linens washed, and order maintained in noble households. Clerks were just as bound to their lists as monks in monasteries. A castle, with its many chambers and residents, produced mountains of laundry. Servants carried piles of linen tablecloths from feasts, sheets from noble beds, tunics from squires, cloaks from huntsmen. Each had to be counted, recorded, and filed away in the household accounts. The noble clerk, seated at a desk in the steward's chamber, dipped his quill in ink and began. 3 table linens, washed. For tunics, washed. 2 cloaks washed. Line after line, the same pattern unfolded. He was not a storyteller, not a poet. His job was to make certain that everything was accounted for, that no garment disappeared without record. Accuracy was his pride, though pride was a poor reward for endless repetition. The steward might review the accounts, nodding with approval or frowning at discrepancies, but the clerk received no praise, no song, no thanks. His writing was expected, as ordinary as breathing. If he failed, the household faltered. If he succeeded, no one noticed. And so his pen continued, each stroke of ink adding another layer to the thick fabric of monotony. When we read these records today, we feel the weight of their dullness, yet within their sameness lies a curious intimacy. These were not abstract numbers. They were the garments of real people, worn against real skin, stained with the marks of real lives. The clerk stripped away all detail, reducing them to mere entries. But in that reduction lies the quiet presence of those who lived centuries ago. Imagine him at work, late into the night. The only sound, the soft scratching of his quill and the occasional sigh as he shifted on the wooden bench. Perhaps his candle sputtered, threatening to plunge him into darkness. Perhaps his hand cramped from writing the same words again and again. Still, he pressed on, because the laundry had to be recorded. The garments did not matter to him, only the numbers. And in the end, it is the numbers that remain. The monotony of clerical work did not merely fill pages. It shaped the very body of the man who wrote them. A medieval clerk lived in the stillness of parchment and ink, bound by duties that seemed endless. He bent over the desk so often that his back grew hunched, his shoulders permanently curved toward the page. His fingers, stained black with ink, bore the proof of countless hours spent guiding quill over parchment. His eyes blurred with the effort of reading in dim light, candle flames guttering and filling the chamber with smoke. To outsiders, he looked like a man of learning, but to himself, he was little more than a servant of lists. Unlike the washerwoman, whose labor was measured in sweat and aching muscles, the clerk's burden was patience. He needed the ability to endure boredom without complaint. His pen scratched line after line, repeating the same words, until they ceased to hold meaning. Perhaps he whispered them to himself, under his breath: robe, cowl, linen, hose. The chant became mechanical, a prayer, without devotion, a rhythm that dulled the mind. It was easy to drift away in thought, yet his hand had to remain steady, for errors were not tolerated. Sometimes his work stretched long into the evening. A single candle might burn low, dripping wax onto the wood, threatening to extinguish before the account was complete. The clerk's eyes watered, and his hand trembled slightly, but still, he wrote. Accuracy was the essence of his position, and each garment required its tally. He may have wondered, in quiet moments, why such dull tasks mattered, but he could not voice such doubts. His obedience was as essential as the washerwoman's labor. There was no celebration when the books were balanced, no feast, no applause, no gratitude. His efforts were invisible, the sort of labor noticed only in absence. If a record was missing or an account wrong, voices would rise in anger, but if every line was perfect, there was silence. Silence, and another page to fill the following day. The records that survive from noble houses and monasteries today are testament to his diligence. Each one is uniform, steady, careful. They reveal nothing of the man himself, no hint of his voice, his humor, his fatigue. Only the garments remain, reduced to numbers and ink, stripped of life. And yet, in that very stripping, we find a strange kind of beauty. The monotony itself has meaning. It tells us of a man who lived his days in repetition, who found order in dullness, and whose work, though unnoticed, has endured longer than his name. In this way, the clerk mirrored the washerwoman. Both lived in cycles. Both bore weight, one of cloth, the other of ink. Both were uncelebrated, yet essential. Together, they revealed the fabric of medieval life, not glory or grandeur, but endless lists, endless labor, endless monotony. There is a quiet irony in the survival of medieval laundry records. They were never written to be remembered, never crafted to inspire. They were tools, nothing more simple lists, meant to keep households and monasteries in order. Yet centuries later, they remain, outlasting the lives of those who penned them. The clerk who bent over his desk, the washerwoman who bent over the river, both have vanished into dust. But the words remain, whispering of a world where boredom was the rhythm of survival. The records themselves are shockingly dull. No flourishes, no descriptions, no glimpses of personality. Just line after line, 2 linens washed, 1 robe washed, 4 hose washed. At first, the repetition numbs the mind. Yet, as you read, a strange calmness sets in. The dullness becomes hypnotic. The sameness soothes like a lullaby. What once drained the energy of the clerk now eases the listener centuries later, guiding them into rest. In their very monotony, these records hold truth. They remind us that history was not only made by kings and knights, but also by the mundane tasks that sustained daily life. The inked lists tell of ordinary survival garments kept clean, order maintained, dignity preserved. Without them, the great dramas of history could not have unfolded. For even soldiers and monarchs required washed clothes and clean linens. The boring work of clerks and laundresses underpinned everything else. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about these documents is how unremarkable they intended to be. They were not crafted for beauty, but for necessity. And yet, in their starkness, they reveal more than they conceal. They show us that human existence is not built from moments of grandeur, but from cycles of repetition. The clerk did not set out to tell a story, but his lists tell one anyway, a story of monotony, patience, and endurance. When we allow ourselves to sit with that monotony, to accept it, we discover its strange gift. The rhythm of repetition slows the mind. The sameness becomes steady, comforting. Just as the clerk's eyelids must have grown heavy as he copied line after line, so to do ours as we imagine his work. The boring history of clerks and their records is, in its way, the perfect history for sleep. And so, as you listen, picture the quiet room, the single candle flickering, the quill scratching softly against parchment. Picture the clerk, his back bent, his hand moving slowly, his face blank with concentration. The words he writes are not meant to entertain you. They are meant only to record. Yet they become something more, a bridge from the busy present to the quiet of the past. A lullaby of ink and parchment, a reminder that even the dullest moments hold meaning when we let them. The tools of medieval laundry were as plain and unchanging as the work itself. There was no innovation, no marvel of design, no clever device to make the job easier. Instead, there were simple objects, fashioned from wood, stone, and cloth, used again and again until they wore down to nothing. These tools did not carry prestige or elegance. They were the companions of boredom, instruments of monotony, serving faithfully without ever receiving notice. The most essential tool was the tub. Made of wood, bound with iron hoops, it held water for soaking and rinsing garments. Some were small, carried easily by one person. Others were large enough to require 2 or 3 hands to lift when filled. They leaked sometimes, swelling with water until the staves creaked. Washerwomen grew used to these imperfections, patching leaks with rags or wedges of wood. The tubs were heavy, even when empty. When full, they bent the backs of those who bore them. Yet, without them, laundry could not be done. Then there were the stones. Smooth, flat river stones served as makeshift washboards. Clothes were laid against them, beaten rhythmically with wooden paddles, or simply with the fists. The impact loosened dirt, though it also wore out the fabric over time. The sound carried across villages, the dull thump of cloth against stone, repeated hundreds of times a day. To those who lived near the wash sites, it became background noise, as constant as the ringing of bells or the crowing of roosters. Soap was another tool, though in truth it was harsh and unpleasant. Made from a mixture of ash, lye, and animal fat, it stung the skin, reddened fingers, and left a sharp odor that clung long after the washing was done. In times of scarcity, sand or even urine was used to scour garments. The washerwoman learned to endure these substances. Her hands cracked and raw, her lungs filled with acrid smoke from soap-making fires. She did not complain. There was no other way. Cloths themselves became tools. Old rags were used for scrubbing, worn-out garments, repurposed to wipe stains. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap of fabric had a use, even if only to absorb dirt so that other garments might emerge cleaner. In noble households, laundresses sometimes had access to imported soap or finer brushes, but the difference was small. The labor remained the same. Together, these tools defined the rhythm of laundry. Wooden tubs, stones, soap, rags, they did not change with the centuries. They were not improved, because improvement was not expected. Laundry was dull, and so its instruments were dull as well. The washerwoman accepted them, the clerk recorded their results, and history passed them by. Yet, in their plainness, they reveal the endurance of those who wielded them, day after day, season after season, in a cycle as endless as time itself. The paddle was one of the washerwoman's most trusted tools. Shaped from wood, broad and flat at the end, it was used to strike garments against stones or tubs. The repeated blows helped force out dirt, but they also tore at fabric, leaving garments thinner each time. The washerwoman knew this and used the paddle carefully, balancing force with restraint. Too light, and the garment remained soiled. Too hard, and the fabric might not last another season. It was a delicate balance, performed not with thought, but with habit. Repeated until it became instinct. The paddle also carried sound. Its thwack echoed with every strike, creating a rhythm that marked the day. To hear a row of washerwomen working together was to hear a kind of dull percussion, each paddle rising and falling in near unison. The sound was not music, but it was pattern. It filled the air with a reminder that labor was underway, that garments were being scoured into cleanliness. Buckets served as companions to the tub. Made of wood or leather, they carried water from streams to homes, filled tubs, and rinsed garments. The act of hauling water was itself exhausting. A full bucket could weigh more than a child, and the washerwoman carried several in succession. Trips between the water source and the washing site were constant, each step measured by the sloshing weight of liquid. Spilled water meant wasted effort, and so each journey was performed with weary care. Drying required tools as well, though none were elaborate. Ropes strung between posts, hedges used as racks, even the branches of trees served to hold wet garments. In noble estates, wooden frames sometimes stood in courtyards, but peasants relied on whatever was near at hand. Wind tugged at garments, rain ruined them, and birds sometimes carried off scraps of cloth. Yet still, the garments were spread, because drying was as vital as washing. Wet garments left too long would rot, mildew spreading in dark stains, undoing hours of labor. The tools wore out quickly. Wood cracked from constant dampness. Ropes frayed. Buckets split. Paddles splintered. Washerwomen mended what they could, binding buckets with strips of leather, patching tubs with iron nails, smoothing paddles with knives. Every tool bore scars of its service, just as the women bore scars of their labor. The cycle of wear and repair mirrored the cycle of laundry itself, endless, repetitive, and without conclusion. To modern eyes, these tools seem primitive. Yet for centuries, they were unchanged. They were sufficient for the task, and so they endured, just as the people endured. In their dullness, they reflect the nature of medieval life itself, plain, functional, repetitive, and steady. Nothing more was needed, because nothing more was expected. When we think of medieval tools of laundry, we often forget the most constant one of all, the hands themselves. No paddle, no tub, no bucket could replace the raw endurance of human hands. They plunged into icy rivers, gripped slippery cloth, wrung garments until the veins swelled. Fingers cracked from lye, palms hardened from years of beating fabric, nails worn and blackened by dirt that never fully left. The body itself was the washerwoman's first and last tool, and it bore the proof of that service every day of her life. Hands twisted garments to wring out water. The motion repeated so often, it left the wrists aching. Each turn required force, and when the garment was heavy with water, the task grew brutal. Yet she repeated it, again and again, with tunic after tunic, cloak after cloak, linen after linen. This was work that sculpted the body, not toward grace, but toward endurance. The washerwoman's hands told her story more clearly than any parchment ever could. Even feet became tools. Washerwomen often stood barefoot on stones at the river's edge, using their toes to grip slippery surfaces or to press garments into the current. Their soles grew calloused and hard, able to endure sharp rocks or the icy bite of winter water. They carried baskets balanced on hips, guided by bare feet that had grown accustomed to every rut and stone on the village path. The air around the washerwoman was filled with smells born of her tools, the sharp scent of lye soap, acrid and biting, the damp odor of wet wool, sour as it dried, the earthy smell of mud kicked up from the banks. These were not the perfumes of noble courts, but the everyday odors of survival, carried into her skin, her clothing, her very home. Tools extended beyond the practical. Time itself was a tool, though it worked against her as often as for her. The washerwoman learned to read the sky, to judge the drying hours by the angle of the sun. A cloud meant trouble, a sudden rain meant loss. She worked not only with tubs and paddles, but with wind and weather, negotiating each day against forces larger than herself. Even silence was a tool. In the monotony, when voices fell quiet, the washerwoman found a rhythm in her own body, the dip, the scrub, the ring. This rhythm steadied her, guiding her through hours that might otherwise have been unbearable. Her tools were simple, but her endurance transformed them into the machinery of survival. Thus, the tools of laundry were not only objects, but extensions of the human body and spirit. Wooden tubs and stone basins mattered little without the relentless patience of the hands that used them. The true tool of medieval laundry was endurance itself, uncelebrated, unseen, yet woven into every thread of cloth that left the wash line to clothe another day of life. If we look at the medieval laundry site as a whole, we can see the tools arranged like the set of a dull ritual. A tub brimming with cold water stood at the center. Around it, buckets waited, filled again and again by weary arms. Stones lined the riverbank, smoothed by centuries of beating cloth. Paddles leaned nearby, worn with cracks and stains. Soap sat in rough lumps, wrapped in rags to keep it from crumbling. Lines stretched overhead, sagging under the weight of dripping garments. The scene was as familiar as it was unchanging. Every tool had its place, and every place repeated itself, day after day. The washerwoman entered this arrangement like a priestess of monotony, conducting her work with gestures as predictable as a liturgy. She dipped, scrubbed, struck, wrung, spread. The cycle was the same, the tools the same, the outcome the same. Yet still it mattered, for without this ritual, life would decay into filth. Even the sounds created by these tools became part of the atmosphere. The slosh of water poured from buckets into tubs, the crack of paddles striking cloth, the hiss of soap rubbed against fabric, the flapping of wet garments in the wind. To those who worked, these sounds were as dull as the tasks themselves. To us imagining them now, they carry a strange rhythm, a dull music of endurance. When night fell, the tools rested, but never for long. Buckets left by the door, tubs stacked against walls, paddles leaning where they had been dropped. By morning, they were summoned again, drawn back into service by necessity. They aged quickly. Wood swelled and cracked from dampness, ropes snapped from strain, soap wore down to scraps. Nothing lasted, because nothing was meant to last. The washerwoman did not ask for permanence. She only needed enough to see her through another day. In noble households, tools might have been better, made stronger, tubs, imported soap, finer clothespins, but the difference was not enough to ease the labor. The monotony remained. Tools only mirrored the endlessness of the task, never breaking it. The laundress in a castle worked no less than her sister at the riverbank. Tools may have changed slightly, but the rhythm of their dull ritual did not. Thus, the tools of laundry remind us not only of objects, but of time. They reveal that medieval life was not built on inventions or ease but on persistence. The washerwoman's tools were humble, but they shaped her world. They gave form to boredom, and through that boredom, they kept life steady. For in the end, survival depended not on brilliance or innovation, but on the patience to use the same plain tools, in the same plain ways, again and again, without end. If the washerwoman's life was shaped by repetition, the peasant's life was shaped by frustration. Few things caused more quiet arguments in a medieval village than the matter of laundry returned half-complete. A tunic might come back shrunken, a sheet torn, or, most famously, a sock missing. The peasant, who often owned only one or two changes of clothing, could not afford such losses. A single missing garment meant cold nights, exposure in the fields, or embarrassment at Sunday Mass. And so, quarrels brewed as steadily as the river flowed. Imagine a man standing at the edge of the wash site, holding a damp cloak with a hole in its sleeve. His voice is sharp, his words accusing. The washerwoman, weary from hours of labor, replies curtly, reminding him that water and stones take their toll. Around them, other villagers nod or mutter. It is not the first time such an argument has risen, nor will it be the last. Each complaint feels the same, echoes of the same frustration spoken by different mouths across generations. Clerks, too, sometimes recorded these disputes. A marginal note in an account book might state, "One tunic disputed for damage." Rarely did they go into detail, for the argument itself was boring, repetitive, and beneath the attention of chronicles. But to the people involved, it mattered deeply. In a world of scarcity, every thread counted. Losing a garment was not only an inconvenience, but a hardship. Children's clothes were particularly prone to vanish. A pair of hose might be swept away by the current, or a shirt dropped in the mud and spoiled. Mothers scolded, fathers demanded answers, and washerwomen defended themselves with weary shrugs. They could not control the river, nor the weather, nor the accidents of careless helpers. Yet they bore the blame, because their hands were the last to touch the garments. The most common complaint, of course, was the missing sock. Though it sounds humorous now, it was no small matter then. Socks were precious, often made of hand-knit wool, patched again and again, until little of the original fabric remained. To lose one was to lose warmth and comfort, and replacements were difficult to come by. Villagers joked bitterly about the curse of the vanished sock, but behind the laughter was real annoyance. At times, these disputes even reached village courts. A peasant might claim damages, insisting that the laundress pay for the lost garment. The sum was small, perhaps a few pennies, but it mattered. The court, no doubt weary of such trivialities, would listen with bored patience, record the outcome, and move on to the next equally dull case. Thus, even in legal documents, we find traces of the boredom that surrounded laundry. The cycle repeated endlessly. Garments went out, garments came back, and some did not return. Complaints rose, voices argued, and then the work resumed. The monotony of laundry was matched only by the monotony of grievances, both as constant as the seasons themselves. The missing garments became a kind of folklore in the village. Children whispered tales about the river spirits who stole socks, or about mischievous animals who carried them away. Geese were blamed, dogs were accused, even the wind itself was said to be a thief. These stories lightened the dullness of daily life, transforming frustration into a shared joke. Yet beneath the humor, the problem remained, a quiet source of resentment that never fully disappeared. For washerwomen, these accusations were wearying. They knew the risks. A tunic might slip into the current, a sheet might be torn by an unseen stone. They tried to be careful, but mistakes were inevitable. Still, the villagers expected perfection. They wanted garments as clean and whole as the day they were spun. Never mind the harshness of the tools or the relentlessness of the work. When those expectations failed, the washerwoman bore the brunt of blame. Some laundresses developed strategies to defend themselves. They tied garments to stones so they would not float away. They mended small tears before returning items, hoping to avoid complaint. They kept careful counts of what they received and what they returned, so that disputes could be settled by numbers rather than by angry voices. Even so, disputes arose. The human memory was quick to exaggerate losses, and suspicion always hovered over the laundry trade. The monotony of these arguments mirrored the monotony of the labor itself. Every week, the same words repeated: "I gave you 2. Why have you brought me 1? Or this cloak was whole when I handed it over." Each quarrel followed the same pattern, as if scripted by the dullness of necessity. For outsiders, it was tedious. For those involved, it was personal, sharp, and unavoidable. At feasts or gatherings, these stories resurfaced as jokes. Villagers laughed about missing socks or stretched shirts, imitating washerwomen's shrugs or peasants' angry gestures. Laughter dulled the edge of frustration, turning irritation into entertainment. But when the feast ended and laundry resumed, the complaints returned as surely as the garments themselves. Records rarely mention these tensions, but we can sense them in the silences. A list of laundry completed might be followed by a vague note of payment delayed, or of services withheld. Perhaps a laundress had grown tired of accusations and refused to work until she was treated fairly. Perhaps a villager, angry at loss, withheld his coin. The cycle of grievance intertwined with the cycle of washing, both repeating without end. In the end, the complaints were as dull as the garments themselves. They did not change the work, nor end the need. Laundry continued, garments vanished, socks went missing, and voices rose in the same tired chorus. The monotony of survival was written not only in soap and water, but in the endless repetition of human dissatisfaction. In monasteries and noble houses, complaints took on a different form. Servants were the ones responsible for garments, and when something was lost or damaged, it was the laundresses who bore the weight of reprimand. A noble lord might not shout over a missing sleeve, but the steward certainly would. The laundress, standing with head bowed, endured the same words repeated 100 times before. Be careful. This garment is costly. It must not happen again. The tone changed. The speaker changed. But the monotony of the scolding was always the same. The stakes were higher in these grand households. A noble's garment might be trimmed with fur, embroidered with costly thread, or dyed in rare colors. Damage to such clothing was no small matter. A torn linen in a peasant's home meant extra mending. A torn robe in a castle could mean a loss of prestige. And so, while washerwomen of villages endured muttered grumbles, laundresses in noble service endured harsher words, and sometimes deductions from their already meager wages. Yet, even in such places, the cycle of complaint became routine. The steward's sigh, the laundress's apology, the quiet acceptance that the work would never be flawless. These were the rhythms of service. Just as water washed the garments, these scoldings washed through the laundress's ears, leaving no mark but weary patience. She had no choice but to return to her tubs, her paddles, and her endless lists. At times, clerks noted these incidents in the household accounts. A margin might record, 2 napkins, missing, laundress, fined. Such lines are the dullest of all, offering no drama, no detail. And yet, they hint at the constant undercurrent of dissatisfaction. The garments were expected to return unchanged, though every wash wore them thinner. It was an impossible standard, repeated endlessly, accepted by all, yet lamented by all. Villagers, too, learned to turn complaint into ritual. A missing garment might be mentioned not with fury, but with weary resignation. Another sock gone, a man might mutter, shaking his head as though acknowledging the turning of the seasons. In this way, complaint became as predictable as the laundry itself. Just as water flowed in rivers and bells rang in churches, so too did voices rise in quiet argument over damaged cloth. The washerwoman herself developed her own ways of coping. Some laughed at the complaints, shrugging them off with humor. Others grew silent, answering only with downcast eyes. A few pushed back, pointing to the harshness of soap, the cruelty of stones, the whims of weather. But whatever the response, the outcome was the same. The work continued, and so did the grievances. These complaints remind us that boredom does not erase emotion. Even the dullest routines can spark irritation, suspicion, or weary laughter. The history of medieval laundry is not only a story of tools and tubs, but also of the constant hum of human voices, repeating the same words over the same small losses. Century after century, by evening, when the garments hung limp across hedges and ropes, the chorus of complaints quieted for a time. Villagers returned to their cottages, muttering about their missing hose or stretched sleeves. Washerwomen returned to their homes, carrying baskets lighter than before, though their shoulders still bore the weight of unspoken frustration. The day ended not with resolution, but with exhaustion. Tomorrow, or the next week, the cycle would resume. In truth, these disputes rarely escalated. They did not break communities, nor destroy friendships. They simmered, flared, and faded, like sparks in the hearth. They were part of the rhythm of life, accepted as unavoidable. Just as crops sometimes failed, or hens sometimes ceased to lay, so too did garments vanish in the wash. It was a small misery, repeated endlessly. But small miseries shaped daily life, more than grand tragedies ever did. The dullness of these quarrels seeped into the records of history. When courts heard such cases, the scribes wrote in the plainest terms, "Dispute over one tunic. Resolved. No names, no drama, only the flat statement of fact." It is as though the scribes themselves grew bored as they wrote, unwilling to waste ink on such matters. Yet their words, so empty of color, carry to us across centuries the echo of peasant frustration. What is striking is how universal the pattern was. From village lanes to castle courtyards, from peasant huts to monastic cloisters, the story remained the same. Laundry returned, incomplete. Complaints rose. Explanations were offered. Nothing changed. The sameness is almost comforting, as though boredom itself was the common language of medieval life. For the washerwomen, the cycle shaped their reputation. They were respected for necessity, but distrusted for accidents, essential, yet suspect. Their work was praised in silence when done well, condemned in loud words when errors appeared. Few professions bore such thankless weight, and fewer still endured so many tedious arguments. But still they carried on, because the world could not do without them. As the sun set, the laundry lines flapped in the evening wind, carrying with them the faint smell of lye and river water. Children tugged at sleeves, asking for their clothes. Men examined cloaks by firelight, muttering under their breath. Women folded linens, smoothing the wrinkles with hands still raw from labor. The washerwoman sat quietly, her face expressionless, already knowing that another day would bring another round of disputes. This was the boring history of complaint, endless, repetitive, dull, and yet, in that dullness lies the truth of survival. Medieval life was not made of grand battles alone, but of small grievances, repeated so often they became background noise. Missing garments and weary sighs formed part of the endless chorus of ordinary existence. Within the cloistered walls of a monastery, laundry was as inevitable as prayer. Robes grew soiled, linens gathered dust, towels absorbed the daily use of many hands. Though monks lived lives of austerity, the need for cleanliness was constant, and so laundries formed part of the silent rhythm of devotion. The labor was assigned to lay brothers or hired washerwomen, whose work was far from holy in appearance, but essential all the same. Their tubs and stones stood near wells or streams, close enough that water could be fetched without endless journeys. The monotony of monastery laundry matched the monotony of monastic life. Just as bells tolled at fixed hours, so too did laundry return in cycles, robes piling at predictable intervals. The garments were simple, woolen habits dyed dark, coarse linen shirts, rough towels for communal use. Yet their number was large, for monasteries housed dozens, sometimes hundreds, of men. A week's worth of robes filled tubs, until the water grew dark, requiring refill after refill, bucket after bucket, the work stretching long into the evening. Clerks within the monastery kept strict records of laundry, noting when robes were washed, when bedding was changed, and even when towels were replaced. Their writing was as dull as any peasant's account. 20 robes washed, 2 sheets, 4 towels. But to the monks, such detail reflected obedience. Nothing was too small for order, not even the laundering of garments. To read these records today is to feel the weight of dull devotion. A careful tally of cleanliness offered as a quiet act of discipline. For the washerwomen, however, there was no spiritual satisfaction. Their lives were not lifted by the chanting of psalms or the rhythm of bells. They labored with arms plunged in cold water, their backs aching from the endless lifting of robes heavy with wool. Each robe, though plain, grew cumbersome when soaked. Spreading them to dry demanded strength and patience, for the cloth clung stubbornly to its own weight. The women endured this as silently as the monks endured their prayers. The garments themselves carried the odor of monotony. Wool smelled sharp and earthy, lye soap burned the nose, damp cloth filled the cloisters with a sour heaviness. No incense could mask it, no hymn could drown it out. The laundry marked its presence in every sense, a reminder that even in sacred spaces, the dull necessities of the body prevailed. The washerwoman was rarely thanked, for gratitude was not part of the discipline. Her name remained absent from chronicles, her labor reduced to a line in an account book. Yet without her, the holy order would have reeked of unwashed wool. Thus, monastery laundry reveals the same pattern seen in every corner of medieval life: repetition, order, dullness, endurance. The work was boring, but it sustained the very structure of devotion. The monks prayed, the bells rang, the robes were washed, and life went on in its steady, uneventful rhythm. In noble households, the laundress faced a different burden. Unlike the plain robes of monks, noble garments were varied, numerous, and delicate. Linen shirts embroidered with fine thread, velvet cloaks lined with fur, silk veils belonging to noble ladies all required cleaning. Each garment demanded careful handling, yet all fell under the same dull necessity of washing. The laundress's day stretched longer here, not only because of the sheer number of garments, but also because of the fear of error. A damaged tunic could mean lost wages. A ruined gown could mean dismissal. Large estates employed multiple laundresses, often overseen by a housekeeper or steward. They worked in courtyards or separate washhouses, with larger tubs, stronger paddles, and greater supplies of soap than their peasant counterparts. But the labor was no less monotonous. Instead of a few tunics and sheets, there were piles upon piles, enough to fill entire racks. Washing became a procession of garments, each indistinguishable from the last, once soaked and beaten into the same dull folds. The laundresses often worked in teams, their paddles striking in rhythm, the sound echoing off stone walls. To outsiders, it might have sounded like a performance, a dull drumbeat of labor. To the women, it was simply another day, the same as yesterday, the same as tomorrow. They spoke to one another as they worked, voices low, sometimes gossiping about the noble family, sometimes muttering complaints about the endlessness of the task. Their chatter was the only variety in a sea of sameness. Clerks of noble households, like their monastic counterparts, kept precise records. They listed every garment sent to be washed, every towel, every tablecloth stained from feasts. The lists read like inventory, stripped of all life. Yet behind each line stood a laundress bent over a tub, a woman whose labor transformed dirt into dignity. She did not appear in the record. Only the garment did. The noble who wore it might be named. The laundress who cleaned it remained invisible. Drying noble garments demanded space, and so courtyards filled with fluttering cloth. Sheets stretched from wall to wall, tunics hung from lines, gowns carefully spread on wooden frames. The sight was ordinary, but to the laundress it represented hours of back-breaking work, still incomplete until each garment was folded and returned. Rain was their constant enemy, threatening to undo everything, forcing them to start anew. They prayed for clear skies, though their prayers rarely appeared in the household chapel. Thus, noble laundry, though grander in scale, mirrored the same dull cycle as peasant laundry. Garments soiled, garments washed, garments dried, garments returned. The laundress endured her labor as silently as her sisters at the river, her life reduced to endless repetition. Her work hidden behind the silks and linens that graced noble shoulders. Laundry in monasteries and noble households differed in detail, but both shared a reliance on sheer manpower. Neither monks nor lords stooped to wash their own garments. The work fell instead to those at the bottom of the hierarchy. This was often the duty of lay brothers, men of the order, who performed manual labor rather than chanting psalms. In noble households, the burden fell to women hired as laundresses, sometimes bonded servants, sometimes poor villagers seeking coin. The common link between them was monotony. Day after day, year after year, they performed the same dull routine. Garments in, garments out, garments noted, garments forgotten. The laundry cycle in these great institutions was unending. Monks generated soiled robes through their daily prayers, meals, and fieldwork. Nobles, by contrast, generated mountains of garments simply through luxury, multiple changes of clothing each day, layers upon layers of fabric, fine linens used for banquets. The laundress, regardless of setting, stood at the bottom of this pyramid, her arms submerged in cold water, her back bent in the same posture whether the garment belonged to a humble friar or a wealthy lord. What made noble and monastic laundry uniquely dull was scale. A peasant household might wash a dozen garments in a week. A monastery might wash 100. A castle might demand several hundred. The lists reflect this difference, but not in style. The words are the same. 2 sheets washed. 4 tunics, washed. 10 towels, washed. The only change is number. To the clerk, a line was a line, whether it referred to peasant hose or noble gowns. To the laundress, the garments blurred together once wet. All fabric looked the same when beaten against stone. In monasteries, silence deepened the monotony. Washer-bros worked without chatter, their mouths closed by rule, their labor joined only by the sound of paddles striking cloth. In noble households, chatter was allowed, but it rarely lightened the weight of the task. Gossip about the Lord, or laughter about a clumsy servant, could not erase the sameness of lifting, scrubbing, wringing, and drying. The voices, like the garments, repeated themselves endlessly. The monotony reached even into storage. Clean garments were folded and stacked in great chests, indistinguishable piles marked only by number. The steward demanded order, and so each item had its place. But when one opened a chest filled with linen, the sight was not inspiring. It was row upon row of identical folds, plain and white, each waiting to be soiled again. The laundress who placed them there might sigh, already knowing that soon the chest would be emptied and the cycle would resume. Thus, whether in a cloister or a castle, laundry was the same. It was a cycle without climax, a story without plot. The garments passed from body to tub, from tub to line, from line to chest, from chest back to body, and then the whole process began again. It was boring, and that boredom was the essence of its truth. The daily schedule of laundry in noble and monastic life followed a rhythm as steady as bells. At dawn, garments were collected. Servants or lay brothers carried them in bundles, arms straining under the weight. By mid-morning tubs were filled, paddles raised, and soap rubbed into folds of wool or linen. The air filled with the same dull sounds, water sloshing, wood striking, cloth flapping. The sun rose higher, and still the motions continued, unvaried, unremarkable. Meals were taken quickly, often standing, crumbs of bread eaten with damp fingers. Then the labor resumed. By afternoon, garments hung on lines or frames, drooping in the breeze. Monks filed past without notice. Nobles passed through courtyards without thanks. Laundry was invisible, yet it marked every corner of their lives. The sheets they slept on, the robes they wore, the towels they used, all bore the hidden work of unseen hands. Evenings brought no relief. Once the garments dried, they had to be folded, sorted, and returned to their rightful owners. In monasteries, this meant stacks of identical robes, indistinguishable save for their tally. In noble houses, this meant the careful sorting of garments by rank and person, the lord's tunic, the lady's gown, the squire's hose, the servant's shirts. Errors brought reprimands, so care was demanded even at the end of long hours. The laundress, weary from the day, forced her aching hands to fold neatly, her tired eyes to see clearly. The monotony extended into record-keeping. Clerks noted what was washed, when it was washed, and how many pieces were returned. The entries filled pages with endless sameness, a dull chorus of numbers and garments. To us, they seem meaningless, yet they are among the most enduring fragments of medieval life. While chronicles of battles and kings are dramatic, it is these plain lists that show us how people lived each day, wrapped in cycles of work that rarely changed. Weather was the greatest enemy. Rain undid hours of labor, forcing garments back into tubs. Wind carried linens into mud. Winter froze fabric stiff, making even simple wringing a brutal task. The laundress worked in all seasons, her schedule set not by comfort but by necessity. The garments could not wait. The cycle could not pause, and so, day after day, the laundress's life merged with the rhythm of laundry. She rose with the garments, labored with the garments, ended her day with the garments. In noble households and monasteries alike, her existence was bound to fabric and water. The monotony of it seeped into her bones, dulling her spirit, yet sustaining her survival. It was not heroic, but it was essential. Laundry in these institutions reveals the truth of medieval life, endurance in the face of endless repetition, quiet patience in the face of endless need. The dull constancy of laundry in monasteries and noble households offers us a mirror into the wider world of medieval life. Both places so different in wealth and purpose were united by the sameness of their needs. Monks in their cloisters prayed, nobles in their halls feasted, yet both depended on unseen hands to keep their garments clean. Without those hands, The odor of daily existence would have overpowered even the incense of churches or the perfumes of courts. Laundry was boring, but it was also indispensable. For the laundress, the monotony was her inheritance. She did not expect her work to change. The garments piled up as surely as the days passed, and so she bent her back again and again, never asking why. In this sense, she resembled the monk who prayed the same prayers daily, or the noble who dined at the same hours each evening. Repetition bound them all. Though only the laundress's repetition was marked by labor rather than privilege, her work shaped the very image of order. The neat folds of linens on noble beds, the uniform robes of monks at prayer, the crisp cloth laid on tables for banquets, these were not the work of chance. They were the result of her dull persistence. She remained invisible, but her absence would have been glaring. The monotony of her work became the background against which the rest of medieval life unfolded. Records hint at this truth. Household accounts list laundry in the same flat words as they list food or candles. Monastic registers record robes washed alongside bread baked and ale brewed. The language is lifeless, yet its very dullness speaks to its necessity. Laundry was not worth embellishing, but it was always worth noting. Its presence was assumed, its absence intolerable. The laundress herself received little recognition. Her wages were meager, her place low. At times, she was blamed for errors, at times scolded for delays. Rarely, if ever, was she thanked. And yet, she endured, because survival demanded it. She had no choice but to return, to soak, to scrub, to wring, to dry. Her life was a litany of labor, each day echoing the last dot to us, centuries later. There is something strangely comforting in this monotony. The sameness that dulled the laundress's spirit soothes our own. Listening to the repetition, imagining the endless tubs and paddles, we feel our thoughts slow, our minds quiet. The boredom that weighed on her becomes the very thing that lulls us to rest. Thus, the story of laundry in monasteries and noble households is not one of drama, but of dullness. It is a story without climax, without heroes, without surprise. Yet in that dullness lies its power. For monotony, endured across generations, is the true foundation of history. The washerwoman and the laundress, bent over their tubs, gave shape to a world that never saw them, but could not have lived without them. The rhythm of laundry was shaped not only by tubs and paddles, but by the seasons themselves. Each turn of the year brought new struggles, new miseries, and the same dull repetition. The washerwoman did not have the luxury of waiting for good weather. Garments grew dirty regardless of sun or rain, and so she bent to her task whether the world around her was gentle or harsh. The monotony endured, but the conditions under which it was endured shifted with the seasons. In spring, the river swelled with melted snow, running swift and cold. The washerwoman's hands plunged into water so frigid that her skin burned, her knuckles turning red and raw. The garments, heavy with dampness, clung to her fingers, refusing to release their weight. The banks, softened by thaw, turned to mud beneath her feet. Baskets tipped, garments slipped, and the work stretched longer with each misstep. The sharp winds carried damp smells across the village, a constant reminder of the season's burdens. Summer brought no mercy, only different trials. The heat beat down on bent backs, sweat dripping into tubs, mingling with soapy water. The garments dried faster in the sun, but the washerwoman's body withered under its glare. Her skin baked, her shoulders burned, her mouth grew parched. Flies buzzed around damp cloth, drawn by the sour scent of lye. The labor did not lighten. It simply shifted its weight from cold to heat, from numbness to exhaustion. Autumn brought its own monotony. The air grew damp, the rains frequent. Paths to the river turned slick with mud, so that each step became a careful balancing act. A stumble meant disaster. A basket dropped, a cloak ruined, hours of work undone. Garments took longer to dry, hanging limp for days, growing musty in the wet air. The washerwoman's patience frayed with the weather, yet still she labored, for garments could not wait for the sun. Winter was the cruelest. Ice formed along riverbanks, tubs froze solid overnight, and water bit like knives against bare skin. Fingers cracked and bled, nails broke, joints stiffened. The washerwoman wrapped herself in rags, but the cold seeped into her bones. The garments grew stiff with frost, refusing to bend, and still she wrung them with numb hands. Smoke from hearths offered no comfort here. The river was her post, and the garments her duty. The seasons turned, and the cycle began again. Spring thaw, summer heat, autumn rain, winter frost each brought misery, each demanded endurance. The washerwoman bore it all in silence, her life tethered to the unchanging rhythm of laundry, her struggles repeating with the turning of the year. The changing seasons did not merely alter the conditions of labor, they altered its risks. Spring floods carried garments downstream, lost forever to the current. A missing tunic might mean days of dispute, accusations, and weary explanations. Summer heat risked fading colors, the sun leaching dye from fabric until noble garments dulled. Autumn storms ruined drying lines, scattering clothes into mud, forcing laundresses to scrub the same garment twice. Winter froze tubs until they cracked, the wooden staves splitting under the pressure of ice. Each season carried its own disasters, and each disaster brought the same cycle of complaint. In monasteries, seasonal laundry was carefully scheduled. Robes were washed less frequently in winter, when water was nearly unbearable, and more often in summer, when drying was easier. Yet, even with planning, the work remained dull and repetitive. The lists still read the same: 10 robes washed. The only change was the season noted in the margins, perhaps a remark about weather, perhaps a note of delay. For the laundress, the work felt no lighter, only slightly shifted by circumstance. Noble households bore greater risks, for their garments were more delicate. Fur linings molded in damp autumn air, silk stiffened in winter, velvet shrank in the heat of the sun. The laundress lived in constant fear of error. A gown damaged by rain was more than a personal failure. It was a household shame. She learned to read the weather with desperate attention, her eyes scanning the sky as carefully as her hands scanned fabric for stains. Yet her vigilance rarely altered her fate. The seasons ruled the work, not her skill. Peasant households suffered most in winter. With little access to soap or fresh water, they endured the smell of damp wool and stale sweat, waiting for a day warm enough to wash. When the garments were finally taken to the river, they were so stiff with dirt that scrubbing felt like punishment. The washerwoman worked until her arms trembled, her breath forming clouds in the frosty air. The garments emerged cleaner, but at the cost of her strength. The next week, the cycle resumed, unchanged. The monotony of seasonal struggle reveals the truth of medieval life. No season brought ease. Each one carried its own burdens, its own dull rhythm of hardship. Spring chilled the bones, summer scorched the skin, autumn drowned the work in mud, winter froze it into ice. Yet through it all, the washerwoman continued, as constant as the river itself. Her endurance became the true measure of survival, her monotony, the true rhythm of time. The seasons not only shaped the washerwoman's labor, but also the tools she used. Wooden tubs swelled in summer heat, their staves loosening until water leaked through gaps. In winter, those same tubs shrank in the cold, splitting with sharp cracks as ice formed inside. Buckets grew heavier in spring, when swollen rivers demanded constant refilling. Lines for drying garments sagged under autumn rains, ropes snapping beneath the weight of drenched cloth. The tools were plain, but the seasons punished them relentlessly. Just as they punished the hands that wielded them, the washerwoman adjusted as best she could. In summer, she worked early in the morning, hoping to escape the worst heat. In winter, she wrapped her arms in cloth, a feeble guard against water that burned with cold. She prayed for steady skies in autumn, knowing that one sudden storm could undo hours of labor. In spring, she moved quickly, chasing the fleeting sun between rains. Her work never ceased. It only bent under the pressure of nature's cycles. The monotony of complaint followed the seasons as well. In winter, peasants grumbled that garments returned damp and stiff, impossible to wear without warming by the fire. In summer, they muttered that colors had faded, their tunics lighter than before. In autumn, they cursed mud stains that lingered despite scrubbing. In spring, they accused washerwomen of losing garments to the river's swollen current. The words changed slightly, but the rhythm of dissatisfaction remained steady, as dull as the work itself. Monasteries recorded seasonal struggles with their usual flat precision. A clerk might note, robes delayed on account of frost. Another entry might read, "Linen spoiled by rain." The words offered no drama, no sympathy, only fact. Yet behind those plain notes stood hours of wasted effort, aching backs, and weary sighs. The laundress herself was invisible in the record, her misery reduced to a single marginal remark. In noble households, stewards kept closer watch. They demanded schedules, insisted on precautions, and scolded when weather undid the work. But the laundress had no power over the sky. She bent to the task again, mending what she could, washing what she must, her hands red and raw with effort. She accepted blame as she accepted the seasons without choice, without change. And so, the seasons passed, each one bringing its own weary monotony. The washerwoman endured them all, her life bound to the rhythm of earth and sky. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, her work did not end, only shifted its shape. The garments soiled, the garments washed, the garments dried, and then the garments soiled again. The year rolled forward, but the cycle remained fixed. A dull circle without escape. If one listens closely, the seasons themselves seem to speak in the rhythm of laundry. Spring whispers with running water, the rush of swollen rivers carrying garments downstream. Summer hums with buzzing flies, the slap of paddles echoing beneath the heat. Autumn groans with dripping cloth, rain tapping against lines heavy with wet garments. Winter crackles with ice, the sound of fabric frozen stiff, breaking beneath numb fingers. The washerwoman lived within these sounds, her life scored by the dull music of weather and water. The cycle left its mark not only on her body, but on her spirit. Each season carried a weight she anticipated long before it arrived. She dreaded spring floods, feared summer exhaustion, braced for autumn storms, and endured winter frost. Her life was not marked by festivals or feasts, but by the repeating trials of weather. She knew the world, not by holidays, but by the endless tasks of laundry under shifting skies. To modern eyes, this may seem bleak, but it was simply life. The washerwoman did not imagine escape. She did not hope for easier tools or better seasons. She accepted monotony as the structure of existence. Each year blended into the next, the cycle of seasons indistinguishable from the cycle of laundry itself. Garments dirtied, garments washed, garments dirtied again. Spring returned, summer followed, autumn came, winter closed, all repeating endlessly, like garments on a line fluttering in the same dull wind. Even in records, the seasons echo. Clerks, noting the rhythm of chores, repeated the same remarks year after year. Robes delayed in frost, linens spoiled in rain. The words recur, like the turning of the year itself. To read them is to feel the monotony of centuries compressed into parchment, the dull heartbeat of life written in ink. Nothing changes, nothing surprises. Only the cycle endures. And yet, within that cycle, survival was sustained. The washerwoman's patience, her strength, her silent acceptance, allowed others to live more comfortably. Monks prayed in clean robes, nobles feasted on linens free of stains, peasants trudged in tunics washed of mud. Their lives, though more visible, rested on her invisible endurance. Thus, the seasons remind us that monotony was not emptiness, but foundation. The dullness of laundry, repeated under spring's rains, summer's sun, autumn's storms, and winter's frost, formed the quiet ground on which all else was built. It was boring, yes, but boredom was the essence of stability. And in that stability, life endured, year after year, season after season, without end. Laundry in the medieval world was shaped not only by tools and seasons, but by gender. It was a task bound almost entirely to women, defined by their labor, their patience, and their invisibility. Men might write about laundry, record its costs, or complain when garments went missing, but it was women who bent over the tubs, who bruised their arms against stones, who wrung out garments until their joints ached. The cycle of washing was, in its dullness, also the cycle of women's work. From the youngest years, girls were drawn into this monotony. A daughter might begin by carrying small buckets, helping to hang cloth, or mending small tears. By adolescence, she was expected to know the rhythm of washing as surely as she knew the prayers of the church. Her hands learned the feel of lye soap, her arms grew strong from wringing. The dull repetition of laundry became not only her duty, but her training for life. To be a woman was to know the endlessness of cloth. Marriage only deepened this bond. A wife bore the responsibility of her household's garments, whether she washed them herself or entrusted them to another. Even if she was noble and employed laundresses, she still oversaw the task, ensuring that garments were returned and kept in order. Her identity was tied to fabric, the state of her linens, the cleanliness of her husband's tunic, the preservation of her children's clothes. Laundry was not just work. It was proof of her diligence. For unmarried women, laundry sometimes provided employment. Washerwomen earned meager wages, carrying the burden of other families' garments. They were often widows, abandoned wives, or poor women with no other means of survival. Their lives revolved around laundry, day after day, with little hope of escape. The monotony pressed harder upon them, for they washed not only their own garments, but also those of others. Their lives doubled in dullness. Men's role was largely supervisory. Clerks recorded garments, stewards assigned tasks, peasants complained about lost socks, but men rarely touched the tubs themselves. In rare cases, monks or lay brothers washed robes, yet even then, the task was seen as humble, fit for those of lesser status. Laundry was not considered men's work because it was not seen as worthy of their time. Its dullness was delegated to women, its invisibility reinforced by gender. Thus, gender roles shaped not only who did laundry, but also how it was perceived. Women's labor was constant, necessary, and repetitive, but it was also dismissed. To the medieval mind, laundry was too dull to be celebrated, too ordinary to be remembered. And because it was women's work, it remained doubly invisible and seen in records, unvalued in chronicles, forgotten in memory. Yet it was there, shaping every thread of daily life. The invisibility of women's laundry work is striking when compared to the visibility of men's labor. Fields plowed, buildings raised, battles fought. These acts were recorded in chronicles, sung in ballads, celebrated in stories. But laundry, though just as essential, received no such honor. It was too dull, too ordinary, and too deeply tied to women to be granted recognition. The silence of history reflects the silence of gender. Yet laundry consumed as much time as any man's task. A woman might spend entire days at the river, scrubbing garment after garment. She would return home with raw hands and aching muscles, only to cook, mend, and tend children. Her labor stretched without pause, one task flowing into the next. The dullness of laundry blended with the dullness of other chores, forming a life without rest. Even within households, laundry reinforced gender expectations. A husband might complain about a missing sleeve, but he did not step forward to scrub. A son might mutter about a torn tunic, but he did not carry water from the well. Daughters were trained to take their mother's place, while sons were trained to avoid it. Thus, the cycle of monotony was inherited by women alone, repeated across generations, without change. In noble estates, laundresses occupied a strange space between necessity and disdain. Their labor was required, but their presence was lowly. They touched the garments of nobles, yet were never invited into noble circles. They handled silks and furs, but they themselves wore patched rags. They were near the center of power, yet always pushed to the margins. Their gender ensured that their work was expected but never praised. Religious thought reinforced these roles. Preachers spoke of women as caretakers of the household, their virtue measured in diligence and cleanliness. A good wife was one whose linens were white, whose husband's tunic bore no stain. Laundry thus became not only work, but morality. A woman's honor was tied to the dullness of her labor, her worth measured in cycles of soap and water. For men, labor could bring glory. For women, labor brought only expectation. And so, gender fixed the boundaries of monotony. Women bore the endless tasks of washing, men bore the endless task of ignoring it. Both roles were steady, repetitive, and dull. But while men's monotony sometimes reached chronicles, women's remained silent. The true history of medieval laundry, then, is also the history of women's invisibility work, done endlessly, remembered rarely, shaping the fabric of life while fading into the background. The monotony of laundry was not merely about work. It was about how women's time was consumed. Laundry swallowed hours, sometimes days, and left little room for anything else. A woman might rise at dawn, carry water before breakfast, and spend the whole morning scrubbing and wringing. The afternoon was for drying, folding, and mending, and by evening she still faced cooking, spinning, or tending the hearth. Her life was a chain of tasks, linked so tightly that no link could be broken. The dullness of one chore flowed seamlessly into the dullness of another, with no pause between. This division of time reinforced women's dependence. Men controlled fields, wages, and records, while women carried garments, baskets, and buckets. The tasks were unequal in recognition, but equal in necessity. Without food, life ended. Without clothing, dignity collapsed. Women ensured the second, and yet their role remained dismissed. Their days disappeared into the repetition of work that left no monuments and earned no praise. Even festivals or feast days offered little relief. While men celebrated, drank, or rested, women still carried the burden of cleanliness. Garments dirtied more quickly during celebrations. Food spilled, ale splashed, mud tracked into halls. The washerwoman's workload doubled, even as her recognition shrank further. On the very days when joy was proclaimed most loudly, her monotony deepened most heavily. Clerks and stewards, always men, recorded women's work without acknowledging it. They wrote lists of garments, counts of robes, and numbers of linens, but they never wrote the names of the women who bent their bodies over tubs. In rare cases, a laundress appears in records, but only when fined or punished. Praise was absent. Silence surrounded her. The record of laundry became the record of invisibility, a dull echo of garments without the voices of the hands that cleaned them. For women, monotony became identity. To be a wife was to scrub. To be a mother was to mend. To be a widow was to wash for others. Each role circled back to laundry, tying gender to water, soap, and cloth. Their lives unfolded like garments themselves, worn thin by use, patched by necessity, ignored by those who depended on them most. The monotony of laundry was the monotony of womanhood. This monotony shaped memory as well. Women were less often remembered by name, less often mentioned in chronicles, but they were remembered through fabric. A clean tunic on a man's back, a fresh sheet on a noble's bed, a robe prepared for a munkle, carried the invisible mark of women's work. They endured in silence, woven not into parchment, but into the fibers of cloth itself. Thus, the gendered cycle of laundry was more than a task. It was a system of survival that bound women's lives into endless repetition. It was boring, thankless, and invisible. Yet it was the fabric upon which the rest of medieval society rested, folded silently into history. The dullness of gender roles in laundry also shaped how communities viewed women. Washerwomen were often subject to gossip. Their presence at rivers or washhouses, making them visible in ways that contrasted with their low status. Villagers joked about their constant complaints, their raw hands, their weary backs. Noble households muttered about laundresses spoiling garments or working too slowly. Monks scolded washer brothers for mistakes, but washerwomen bore sharper judgment. Their very labor made them targets, for it was public, physical, and mundane. The monotony of this judgment mirrored the monotony of the task itself. Washerwomen endured the same words repeatedly. Careful with my cloak. Do not lose my sock. This tunic is thinner than before. These lines echoed across generations. The same complaints spoken by different mouths in different centuries. For the women, the words became background noise, no different than the slosh of water or the thump of cloth. Against stone, their gender ensured they carried the blame more heavily than men. If a lay brother ruined a robe, it might be excused as part of duty. If a woman ruined a garment, it was tied to her very nature, evidence, some said, of carelessness or weakness. The monotony of blame became a rhythm as steady as the work itself. Unfair yet unbroken. At the same time, women built quiet solidarity around this burden. Washerwomen joked with one another, shared stories, and offered comfort when accusations grew sharp. The dullness of their work gave space for companionship, and in that companionship, they found small moments of relief. Their laughter, though quiet, was a form of resistance against the endlessness of both labor and blame. Religious teachings reinforced the dull morality of laundry. A clean household reflected a woman's virtue. A soiled garment suggested neglect. Priests preached about women as keepers of order, responsible for the visible dignity of the family. Laundry became more than necessity, became a test. A woman's reputation could hang on the whiteness of linens or the neatness of garments. Her morality reduced to cycles of soap and water. The monotony of virtue became as binding as the monotony of labor. Even in this, women's work remained invisible in records. Clerks continued to list garments without naming hands. Stewards continued to scold without offering thanks. The dullness of laundry and the dullness of gender roles merged into one, erasing individuality, leaving only repetition. And yet, through that repetition, women sustained entire communities. Thus, the story of gender and laundry is not one of heroism or recognition, but one of quiet monotony. Women's work was endless, invisible, and judged more harshly than men's. But it endured, shaping every household, every monastery, every noble estate. In the dull rhythm of soap and water, women carried the weight of survival, even as history turned its eyes elsewhere. The monotony of laundry as women's work reached beyond the tubs and into the fabric of medieval culture. Ballads and chronicles rarely mentioned laundresses, but when they did, it was often with mockery or suspicion. Washerwomen appeared as background figures in stories, carrying baskets or gossiping by rivers. They were symbols of labor without glory, their presence so ordinary it became invisible. Men wrote of knights, of battles, of merchants, but rarely of the women who scrubbed their clothes. The silence itself is the loudest record of gendered monotony. For women, this silence was both a curse and a strange protection. Their labor was overlooked, but in being overlooked, it also escaped scrutiny from power. While nobles fought wars and monks debated doctrine, washerwomen carried on unseen, their monotony uninterrupted by politics or philosophy. Their invisibility was dull, but it was also steady, a quiet survival at the margins of history. In villages, women's laundry formed part of the communal landscape. Riversides became places where women gathered, their chatter mingling with the slap of cloth against stone. Children played nearby, men passed without notice. The scene repeated itself across centuries. Women bent, garments heavy, baskets piled, voices low. No one remembered names, yet everyone recognized the rhythm. Gender ensured the cast of the scene never changed. Daughters replaced mothers, granddaughters replaced grandmothers. The monotony was not only daily, but generational. Even within noble estates, laundresses lived at the edge of recognition. They touched the finest garments, silks imported from distant lands, furs worth fortunes. Yet their own hands bore cracks, their own garments hung in tatters. The contrast was stark but ignored. The lady wore her gown to a feast, admired for her beauty, while the laundress who had cleaned it sat unseen, scrubbing another cloth. The monotony of this contrast was as fixed as the monotony of laundry itself. The connection between gender and dullness was reinforced in law as well. Courts rarely acknowledged men in disputes over laundry. It was women who were fined for lost garments, women who were blamed for damages, women whose wages were docked. The monotony of blame had no balance, pressing harder on those whose work was already heaviest. Each judgment repeated the same verdict. Women bore responsibility, men bore authority, and yet, in this dull rhythm, women created meaning. Their work sustained households, clothed communities, and gave dignity to lives that might otherwise have sunk into filth. The monotony became their quiet contribution, the unseen foundation of society. Though history ignored them, their presence was felt in every clean garment, every folded sheet, every robe prepared for prayer. The story of laundry and gender is, therefore, the story of invisibility turned into endurance. Women bore the endless cycles, generation after generation, without recognition, without thanks. Their monotony was their legacy, woven into every thread of medieval life. It was boring, it was thankless, but it was essential, and in its very dullness, it sustained the world. The history of laundry is not only written in records of garments washed or wages paid. It lingers most vividly in the senses, particularly in smells and sounds. These were the constant companions of washerwomen, shaping their experience, as surely as tubs or paddles. To imagine their world is to imagine the monotony of odors and noises that surrounded them each day. As steady as the rhythm of water itself, the smell of soap was inescapable. Medieval soap, made of lye from ash mixed with animal fat, was harsh and acrid. It burned the nose, stung the eyes, and clung stubbornly to skin. Washerwomen grew used to its sharpness, but it never truly faded. After a day's work, their clothes reeked of it, their hands carried its sting, their hair absorbed its bite. Even when they sat at their hearths in the evening, the smell followed them, dull and oppressive. It was not the fresh scent we imagine today, but a sour tang that spoke of survival rather than cleanliness. Wet wool added its own heaviness. A cloak or robe soaked in water released an odor earthy and sour, almost animal in its depth. Villagers recognized it instantly, the smell of damp fabric that clung to cottages and cloisters alike. When dozens of robes hung together to dry, the odor thickened, filling courtyards with a damp fog of wool and lye. To live among laundry was to live in a haze of smells that dulled the senses rather than refreshed them. Sounds echoed just as persistently. The slap of cloth against stone, the thump of paddles, the endless splash of water poured into tubs. These were the rhythms of laundry. They repeated with such regularity that they lost all meaning, becoming background noise. Washerwomen could strike cloth for hours, their arms moving in time too, sounds that no longer registered. Yet for outsiders, the noise was unmistakable. A village knew its laundry day by the hollow percussion of paddles, as predictable as bells ringing for prayer. Children's laughter sometimes broke the monotony, but even that was fleeting. More often, the soundscape was filled with sighs, grumbles, and weary conversations. Women spoke in low voices, not to distract from their work but to endure it. Their words rose and fell against the steady percussion, forming a dull chorus that blended into the rhythm of water and wood. Thus, the smells and sounds of laundry became the sensory fabric of monotony. They defined the washerwoman's life more than records or accounts ever could. To step into her world was to be surrounded not by silence or sweetness, but by a heavy air of soap and wool, and by a constant beat of labor. It was boring, repetitive, and unchanging, but it was also the sound and smell of survival, endured across generations without relief. The smell of lye soap was joined by another odor, far less pleasant, but equally common: urine. For centuries, urine was used as a cleansing agent, its ammonia strong enough to break down grease and stains. Buckets of it were collected from households, stored until it soured, then poured over garments before scrubbing. The stench was overwhelming, seeping into every corner of the wash site. Washerwomen endured it because they had no choice. But the smell was so sharp it must have made their eyes water, their stomachs turn. Villagers joked about it, but the laundress carried its weight home on her skin, combined with the odor of wet cloth and acrid soap. The smell of urine created a pungent cloud around washhouses and riversides. It was not the smell of cleanliness, but of effort, of labor carried out in harsh conditions. For the laundress, smell became another burden, pressed into her nostrils as firmly as water pressed into fabric. She could not escape it, for it clung even after the work was done. Lingering on her body long into the night, the sounds, too, had layers. Beyond the paddles and water was the creak of wooden tubs swelling and straining, the squeak of ropes pulled tight with dripping garments, the soft hiss of cloth rubbing against cloth. These noises filled the air with a dull symphony, unremarkable in tune, yet constant in presence. They repeated every day, every week, until they faded into monotony. In monasteries, the sounds were softened by silence. Washer brothers worked without chatter, their paddles rising and falling like metronomes. The courtyard echoed with splashes and thumps, unbroken by song or laughter. The monotony there was deeper, because no voice interrupted it. In noble estates, women's chatter layered over the same sounds, but the rhythm remained unchanged. Words, like garments, repeated themselves, the same stories told, the same complaints muttered, year after year. Even the sound of drying was part of the cycle. Wind snapped linens on lines, ropes creaked under strain, cloth rustled in breezes, rain added its own voice, drumming against fabric, spoiling the work. The laundress listened to these sounds with weary familiarity, knowing them as well as she knew her own heartbeat. They did not surprise her. They only reminded her of what was constant, what would return tomorrow and the day after. The smells and sounds of laundry, dull and unchanging, defined the washerwoman's environment more than any record could capture. They were not dramatic, not heroic, but they were steady. They shaped her mood, her patience, her endurance. They dulled her spirit even as they kept her world in order. For centuries, these invisible burdens filled the air of villages, monasteries, and castles alike, turning the very atmosphere into another tool of monotony. Among all the senses, smell lingered longest in memory. Villagers could often tell when laundry had been done not by sight, but by scent. The acrid bite of soap clung to courtyards. The sour heaviness of damp wool drifted through cottages. The faint sharpness of ammonia floated from buckets left too long in the sun. These odors were not pleasant, yet they became familiar, woven into the rhythm of daily life. The washerwoman carried them in her hair, in her clothing, in her very skin, a walking reminder of her monotonous labor. To those around her, these smells marked her identity. A laundress was known not by her name, but by the scent she carried: the bitter tang of soap, the damp musk of cloth, the sour trace of urine. Children wrinkled their noses, men muttered jokes, but no one questioned the necessity. Without those smells, garments would not be clean. Without those smells, dignity would fray. The odors were dull, unpleasant, and constant, yet they were also the scent of survival. The sounds were equally tied to identity. Villagers passing near the river knew Laundry Day by its hollow percussion. The thud of cloth against stone was as familiar as the tolling of church bells. It marked time in its own way, a steady rhythm that told the story of labor without needing words. For those who lived nearby, the noise became background, so constant it barely registered. For washerwomen, it was the soundtrack of existence in noble households. The sound carried through courtyards like a dull heartbeat. Servants grew used to the slap of paddles, the splash of water, the murmur of women's voices. Nobles themselves rarely noticed, for laundry was meant to be invisible. Yet the sound was always there, unacknowledged but unending. The laundresses heard it as clearly as they heard their own sighs. The monotony of sound mirrored the monotony of life itself. The washerwoman's own body added to the soundscape. Her sighs, her muttered complaints, the creak of her joints as she bent and lifted all, became part of the dull chorus. Even silence was noisy, filled with the constant rhythm of effort. To imagine her world is to imagine a place where no sound was sharp, no sound was new, only the endless repetition of the same dull notes. Thus, smell and sound marked not only the task, but the woman herself. They clung to her, shaping how she was seen and how she saw her own life. They dulled her spirit, but they also reminded her that she was part of a cycle larger than herself. Just as garments repeated their journey from dirt to clean to dirt again, so too did smells and sounds repeat, weaving monotony into every breath and every step. The sensory world of laundry reveals most clearly the essence of boredom. Smell and sound were never absent, never varied enough to surprise, never light enough to forget. They pressed into the washerwoman's life until monotony was not only her work, but her environment. She lived inside a cocoon of odors and noises that dulled the senses and slowed the mind. A world where change rarely came, and repetition was the rule. Consider the drying fields of a monastery courtyard. Robes hung in rows, dripping steadily onto stones. The air was heavy with the sour scent of wool, the acrid sting of soap. The only sounds were the drip of water, the creak of lines under weight, the shuffle of feet moving garments from place to place. Hours passed in this dull haze, each minute indistinguishable from the last. It was a scene not of drama, but of endurance, repeated week after week, season after season. In noble estates, the picture was grander, but no less monotonous. Dozens of garments hung from wooden racks, flapping in the breeze, filling courtyards with the mingled smells of lye, damp velvet, and sweat. The laundresses moved silently, adjusting cloth, lifting corners, folding edges. The noise of their paddles was replaced here by the rustle of fine fabrics, but the repetition remained the same. The dullness carried even into luxury, for even silks must be scrubbed, even furs must be dried. For peasants, the sensory burden was heavier still. Their garments smelled of smoke from hearth fires, of sweat from fields, of mud from paths. When washed, these smells mingled with soap and urine until the air grew thick and sour. The sound of their washing was harsher, Two stones clattering, buckets sloshing, children crying nearby. The washerwoman bore it all in silence, her senses dulled by constant exposure, her patience stretched by constant repetition. What unites all these scenes is not difference, but sameness. Whether in monastery, estate, or village, the smells and sounds of laundry did not change. They were the background of life, unnoticed yet unavoidable, boring yet essential. They dulled memory, blurred days, and defined the rhythm of existence. For the washerwoman, this monotony was both her burden and her legacy. When we read the records of garments washed, we see only numbers. But when we imagine the sensory world behind those numbers, we find the true weight of monotony. It was not only in the repetition of tasks, but in the air itself, the sounds themselves. Laundry was boring because it surrounded the senses with sameness, pressing in on every side until there, with nothing left but endurance. Among all the dull complaints surrounding medieval laundry, none was so common or so strangely memorably as the vanished garment. Most often it was a sock, a small piece of woolen hose gone missing between tub and drying line. Though trivial by modern standards, a missing sock could spark hours of muttering, suspicion, and weary dispute. In a world where most people owned only a handful of garments, the loss of even one mattered. A single sock could mean walking with one foot unprotected, or a long evening spent patching scraps to cover what was gone. The washerwoman, already bent from labor, bore the brunt of accusation. A villager might squint at her with suspicion. "I gave you 2, but you return 1. She defended herself with tired words, pointing to the river's current or the rope's slackness. Perhaps the garment slipped into the mud, or perhaps it simply vanished into the monotony of laundry itself. Whatever the reason, the quarrel followed a pattern so familiar, it became almost ceremonial: accusation, denial, resignation. In noble estates, the matter was more serious. A lord might lose patience over a damaged sleeve or a missing napkin, his steward recording the complaint in dry ink. The laundress could be fined, her wages cut for an error that may not have been hers. To lose a commoner's sock meant mutters. To lose a noble's garment meant punishment. The monotony of blame was constant, pressing equally in hut and hall, differing only in severity. Children, too, joined the chorus of complaint. Mothers scolded when shirts disappeared. Fathers shook their heads when hose were stretched beyond use. In some villages, tales grew around the mystery, as though spirits of the river stole garments for sport. Geese, dogs, even mischievous neighbors were accused. Yet all suspicion returned eventually to the washerwoman. She was the last to touch the garments, and so the weight of loss settled always on her shoulders. The monotony of disappearance had its humor. Villagers joked about the curse of the missing sock, a phrase repeated with weary laughter. Yet behind the joke was real frustration. In a world where every garment was precious, each loss carried the sting of necessity. The washerwoman endured these jokes as she endured the smells and sounds of her work, without escape, without change, without end, and so, missing garments became another thread in the dull tapestry of medieval life. They disappeared as regularly as garments were soiled. The complaints followed, the blame followed, the silence followed. It was boring, repetitive, and predictable. But it was also a reminder of scarcity, of how little people possessed, and of how easily necessity could vanish into the river, the mud, or the monotony of laundry itself. The vanished garment was more than an inconvenience. It became a symbol of mistrust. In communities where survival depended on cooperation, the loss of clothing stirred suspicion as surely as the theft of food. Was it an accident, or was it taken? Did the washerwoman misplace it, or did she keep it for herself? These questions were whispered in villages, repeated across generations, as though the mystery of missing garments could never truly be solved. For the laundress, the monotony of accusation wore heavier than the work itself. Each week brought the same wary lines. "You must be more careful. It is not the first time." She lowered her eyes, offered apology, and returned to her tubs. Her protests rarely mattered. In the minds of others, the one who washed was always the one who lost. The dull rhythm of blame was as steady as the dull rhythm of paddles striking cloth. Clerks occasionally recorded these disputes, their notes as lifeless as the arguments they reflected. One hose missing, laundress fined. 2 napkins unreturned, complaint lodged. These flat lines tell us little of the quarrels themselves, but they reveal how common they were. Missing garments appeared so often in records that they became another expected expense, like broken tools or spoiled grain. The monotony of loss was factored into the monotony of life. In noble households, suspicion sometimes turned sharper. A laundress accused of theft might lose her position, or worse, face the courts. Few could prove her guilt, but few defended her innocence. The low status of laundry workers meant their voices carried little weight. Their work was needed, but their words were not trusted. Thus, the cycle of complaint deepened, the dullness of laundry mirrored by the dullness of injustice. For peasants, the vanished garment struck hardest at dignity. A missing tunic could leave a man with nothing fit for Sunday worship. A missing cloak could mean shivering through winter nights. Families patched holes and pieced together scraps to cover the loss, muttering all the while about washerwomen and their carelessness. The monotony of poverty made every missing item feel heavier than its size. Yet, despite all complaint, life went on. Garments continued to vanish. Disputes continued to rise. Washerwomen continued to labor. The missing sock became not a crisis, but a rhythm, an annoyance so common it was absorbed into the cycle of laundry itself. Just as garments dirtied and were cleaned, so too garments disappeared and were lamented. It was boring, predictable, and unending, another note in the dull music of medieval life. The mystery of vanished garments endures in memory, not because it was rare, but because it was constant. The missing sock, the misplaced sleeve, the napkin gone astray, these were the dull truths of medieval life. They were never solved, never prevented, only repeated. Each disappearance blended into the next, each complaint echoed the last, until the pattern became as familiar as the smell of soap or the sound of paddles. The monotony of loss was as much a part of laundry as water itself. For washerwomen, this monotony carried a quiet bitterness. They bore the weight of accusations that could never be disproved. A sock swept away by current, a tunic dropped into mud, a cloth stolen from a line, all of these were beyond their control. Yet the words that followed were always the same: careless, lazy, untrustworthy. These accusations wore on them like another garment, one they could not wash away. Their lives were already dull. The constant cycle of blame made them heavier still. In some cases, missing garments even became part of local humor. Villagers joked that the river had a wardrobe of its own, filled with socks and sleeves gathered over years. Children teased washerwomen, chanting songs about lost hose or vanished cloaks. Laughter softened the sting, but the monotony of ridicule added another layer to the dullness of laundry. What was funny to some was weary to those who lived it. Records treat these losses with the same flat indifference as they treated all of laundry. Garment lost, value deducted, hose unreturned. The words lie still on parchment, giving us no hint of anger, no echo of laughter, only the fact of absence. And yet, in their monotony, these entries remind us of how constant the problem was. Missing garments were not exceptions, but expectations, dull companions to the dull cycle of washing itself. The symbolism of the missing sock reaches even further. It speaks of scarcity, of how fragile survival was. Each garment mattered because each life had so little. A lost sock was not only cloth, it was warmth, dignity, comfort. To us, it may seem trivial. To them, it was necessity. And so the monotony of complaint was fueled not only by frustration but by need, in the end. The vanished garment tells the same story as all of medieval laundry, a story of repetition, of dullness, of endurance. Garments were washed, garments were lost, garments were washed again. The cycle spun endlessly, with no solution, no resolution, no escape. The washerwoman bent to her task. The villager muttered his complaint. The clerk recorded his line, and life moved forward unchanged. Thus, the history of missing garments is not a tale of mystery, but a tale of monotony. The sock that vanished centuries ago was not the first, nor the last. It was simply another thread in the endless fabric of boredom, woven as tightly into medieval life as the garments themselves. The story of medieval laundry is, at its core, the story of monotony. It is not filled with drama, not adorned with heroes, not broken by climaxes. It is a story of repetition, of dullness, of lives spent to the endless cycle of soap and water. Yet in that very dullness lies the truth of survival. The washerwoman, the laundress, the lay brother with aching hands, all lived in the rhythm of garments soiled, garments washed, garments soiled again. Their work was boring, invisible, uncelebrated. But without it, life itself would have frayed. We have walked through their world, the smells of lye, urine, and damp wool, the sounds of paddles striking stone, of water sloshing endlessly, the seasons of misery, spring floods, summer heat, autumn, mud, winter frost. We have seen the tools, plain and unchanging, the tubs and paddles worn by years of use. We have heard the complaints, as steady as the labor itself, missing socks, torn sleeves, garments vanished into rivers or mud. We have traced the records, lines of ink as lifeless as the cloth they described. Every part of the story is dull, every detail repetitive, every echo unvaried. And yet, this is what life was. Monotony woven into every thread. Laundry was gendered, bound to women by expectation and necessity. It shaped their days, their bodies, their identities. It consumed their hours and erased their names. Clerks and stewards recorded garments, but never the hands that scrubbed them. History turned its eyes elsewhere, leaving women's labor in silence. And yet, their presence remained in every robe, every sheet, every tunic prepared for use. They were invisible, but indispensable, boring, but essential. Their monotony was the foundation upon which the visible dramas of men unfolded. The vanished garment, the missing sock, the endless cycle of complaint, these reveal more than amusement. They show scarcity, the fragility of survival, the weight of necessity. They remind us that history was not only made by kings or battles, but by the dull persistence of ordinary people. Their monotony sustained the world, though the world barely noticed. And so, as we reach the end of this long reflection, we recognize the strange paradox of boring history. What dulled the spirits of those who lived it, now soothes the minds of those who hear it. The sameness that once weighed like stone now lulls like a cradle. The monotony of medieval laundry, carried across centuries, has become a gentle rhythm for rest. It is, in its way, the perfect story for sleep. The washerwoman's sighs have faded. The clerk's quill has stilled. The garments they washed and recorded have long turned to dust. But the monotony remains, echoing in memory, steady and unchanging. It tells us that survival is not built from greatness, but from repetition. It was boring, yes. It was dull, yes. But it was also life, and, in that dullness, we find not only history, but a quiet, enduring calm.